Our second reading this morning comes from the book of Genesis and is part of the saga of Jacob, that long and involved and wondrous story that is full of twists and turns. Jacob was known as a trickster, but in coming to find a bride, he runs up against an even craftier trickster in the form of his father-in-law. What can I tell you? In-laws, says he who is a father-in-law himself. Hear then this part of this powerful story. And Jacob saw that Laban did not regard him as favorably as he did before. Then the Lord said to Jacob, "Return to the land of your ancestors and to your kindred, and I will be with you." So Jacob sent and called Rachel and Leah into the field where his flock was, and said to them, "I see that your father does not regard me as favorably as he did before, but the God of my father has been with me. You know that I have served your father with all my strength, yet your father has cheated me and changed my wages 10 times. But God did not permit him to harm me." So Jacob arose and set his children and his wives on camels, and he drove away all his livestock, all the property that he had gained, the livestock in his possession that he had acquired in Paddan Aram, to go to his father Isaac in the land of Canaan. On the third day, Laban was told that Jacob had fled. It is indeed my pleasure and my privilege to introduce our preacher this morning, my good friend and good colleague, Rabbi Myra Soifer. We figured out that this is the fourth time that Myra has preached for us. The Pulpit-Exchange tradition actually extends much longer than either of our tenures here, but Myra has been with us now for a fourth time today, and it is a real pleasure to have her here. There are many things that could be said about Myra. You've heard many of them, read many of them. I think the best thing to say that for me kind of captures the essence of Myra is, especially for you visitors, to note that Temple Bat Yam has been in existence for 26 years, and throughout that history they have made their home here. And last year, Bat Yam held a magnificent party to celebrate their 25th anniversary. It was a fine, fine affair. And the dancing was magnificent. And the person who was on the floor the most and the longest, and I think kissed the band goodnight, was Rabbi Myra Soifer.
Funny, this morning I got compared to Jesus in the earlier service. This one I kissed the bands goodnight. I don't know if that's a progression, John, or what. I'll tell you about it later. I know it sounds a little strange. Well, thank you all. It's a pleasure to be here again. And this year, as in every year that I've had the privilege of being your preacher, this year, once again, your senior pastor and my dear colleague, John Danner, has graciously indulged my propensity to go off lectionary in my choice of Bible reading for the morning. Hence, you just heard that text from Genesis 31. Those verses that were read come very near the end of a narrative section that indeed is chock full of well-known stories, beginning with the narrative of Jacob's falling in love. a love story that, with all its twists and turns and deceptions, would, I dare say, make a fabulous soap opera. It starts when Jacob goes to Haran, the place of his ancestral clansfolk, hoping there to find an appropriate wife. And, sure enough, at the town well, he encounters the very fine, very kind, and very, very beautiful Rachel. He is so smitten that he agrees to work for her father, Lavan, for 7 years in exchange for Rachel's hand in marriage. But Rachel has an older sister, Leah, and tricky Lavan somehow sneaks her, Leah, into the marriage ceremony and the ensuing marriage bed. Only in the morning does Jacob realize the deception, and he then has to work another 7 years so that he can also marry Rachel. Never mind how Jacob could have been so duped. That's sermonic fodder for another time. So back to the story. It continues with a whole lot of conjugal consorting and subsequent childbearing with both Rachel and Leah and their maidservants Bilhah and Zilpah, ultimately resulting in Jacob siring a family of 13, 12 sons and 1 daughter. Also a sermon for another time is how it is remotely possible that so many religious fundies point to such biblical narrative when they want to champion so-called traditional family values. This family, quite frankly, is a dysfunctional mess. But again, we'll leave all that for another time. Instead, I've chosen to focus this morning on the verses that you just heard read. In those verses, Jacob has finished the years of indentured servitude that have earned him his 2 wives. He has prospered along the way, not just with children, but in terms of livestock and other abundance. And considering all that he's seen of his father-in-law Laban's trickery, he sensibly decides it's time to get out of Haran. And so, in just a few verses into the portion that you heard, he gathers his family and all their possessions, and they flee, both the place and its leading bad guy citizen, Laban. And what you just heard includes what the text reports as Jacob's stated rationale for leaving. And I must tell you, it's translated differently in our Bibles than exactly what you heard this morning. As we read it, Jacob says, "I think it is time to go from here back to my parental homeland because Laban's face is not the same to me as it used to be." What can that phrase, Laban's face is not the same to me as it used to be, what does that mean? Well, traditional commentators explain it in a way more in consonance with the text as you heard it this morning. They say that Jacob is saying something about a change in Laban's attitude toward him. Specifically, Jacob is saying that Laban no longer looks upon him with favor. But there's a real problem with that traditional understanding, since Laban never really did look upon Jacob with kindness or favor. Quite the contrary. Laban has always been manipulative, cunning, and even cruel toward his son-in-law. So Rav Kook, the first chief Orthodox rabbi of Israel, Rav Kook offered a different explanation for this phrase. Laban's face is not the same to me as it used to be. Rav Kook teaches that Jacob was really saying the following: we have to leave this place because when I, Jacob, first came here, I looked at this man, Laban, and saw how he lived and how devious he was, the way he did business, and I abhorred him. I was repelled. But now that I have been here for coming on 2 decades, I find that I have gotten used to him. I have reached the point where I think that what he does is what you are supposed to do, that it is normal and proper to be devious. I look at him, and I am no longer shocked or offended. Therefore, we better leave this place and do so quickly. Because if we stay much longer, I will get so accustomed to him and his unethical ways that I will soon become just like him. Lavan's face is not the same to me as it used to be. I've grown accustomed to all his deceit and unrighteousness, and so Jacob fled. I came across a similar story attributed to a famous modern Reform rabbi who was visiting China. It turns out, however, my colleague Jim Rudin is here. He's an expert on this rabbi, and that rabbi never went to China, which is to say that the story is apocryphal, a nice way of saying not really true. But I'm going to tell you the story anyway, aware that it most likely never happened, because I tell it for the rabbi cook-like lesson that it also teaches. So, our supposed rabbi made a supposed trip to China, and when he got there, the only available means of transportation was by rickshaw. And those rickshaws were pulled by weak, old, feeble people who would cough and moan and groan as they dragged their passengers through the streets. At first, the rabbi couldn't stand the sound of the coughing and groaning of those old and feeble rickshaw operators. It gave him a guilty conscience every time he hired a rickshaw to take him around. But after he had been there for a while, he realized a shocking thing. He had gotten so accustomed to the coughing and the groaning that he no longer heard it. At that point, he said to himself, I must leave. Another similar story is told by Elie Wiesel of blessed memory, this time about that earlier Genesis portion on the utterly corrupt cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. In Wiesel's tale, a tzaddik, or righteous, saintly individual, a tzaddik came to the wicked city of Sodom. He was horrified by what he saw. The corruption, the cruelty, the brutality, and all the other evil, it sickened him. So he picketed and protested and cried out against it all. He stood outside the homes and stores and offices of the wicked citizens of the place, and he railed and lifted his voice against all the terrible things that they were doing. And everyone ignored him. This went on for years, until finally someone took pity on him and said, "Don't you see that you are wasting your time? Don't you see that no one is listening?" The tzaddik replied, "You don't understand. When I started, I picketed and protested and cried out in order to change them. Now I do it in order that they should not change me." Many of us are horrified by what we see in the current political world around us. Xenophobia has been enshrined in executive order. Bigots are being put forward for some of the most important posts in our land. Women's rights are in peril. The weakest and most marginalized among us fear imminent harm. The list goes on, and every day the news just seems to get worse. But as frightening and disheartening as I find all that to be, there is something that terrifies me even more. And that is that at some point, God forbid, we run the risk of being so accustomed or hardened or calloused or just plain worn out by ongoing injustice that we'll stop even noticing it. That the face of a contemporary Lavan, in whatever political office, won't be as abhorrent as it used to be because we'll have become numb. And so I place the lesson from today's Bible reading, the commentary from Rav Kook, and the related stories that I just shared. I place all that before us as cautionary imperative. We must not, we dare not, we cannot ever become so habituated or overwhelmed or weary that we become accustomed to injustice. We can't ever allow ourselves to think that moral evil is just the way it is and the way it is going to be. We just cannot become numb or hopeless. Sometimes we have to live with Lavan, but we never have to get used to him. Should we sense that starting to happen? Some of us, like Jacob, may choose literally to flee. But for most, that's not a feasible response, nor may it be even the most courageous. The place to which every one of us can and must flee, if unrighteousness begins to become the norm, the place to which we go is that place of values taught by each of our faith traditions. I turn to the Hebrew scriptures and rabbinic teachings. You turn to Christian text and the teachings of Jesus. But whatever our sacred source, all of us know what is right and good and what the Lord requires of us. In days and weeks and months to come, we may well have to wage the good fight to sustain those religious values of justice, equality, and love. We may not always prevail. But even at those times when we can't change the world and the reality under which it operates, we can and must always fight to make sure that the world doesn't change us and our most sacred values. We learn that from Jacob. We pray that his lesson will sustain us and compel our actions in the days and years ahead.